Okay. Well, we have just spent the last two videos discussing all of the events that led up to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and also Jesus coming into his kingdom. We left our teaching off last week with a verse that I would like to delve into more deeply, and that is Matthew 24, verse 34. It says, this is Jesus speaking. It says, "Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." So basically, all those things we talked about, the false prophets, the earthquakes, the famines, pestilence, wars, rumors of wars, all of that, um, Jesus was telling his disciples about. And then he said this particular verse, saying, "This generation will by no means pass away till all these things have taken place." So the reason I want to go into it a little bit more is because futurists, people with a futuristic eschatology, tend to think that Jesus in this particular verse is speaking to them or us personally right here in 2023. There's a lot of people that think this generation, like my generation, your generation, that all of these events are going to happen to us, instead of looking at them as possibly they have already happened back in, between 30 AD and 70 AD. So we need to really decide uh, who this generation really is and who is Jesus speaking of. Um, a friend of mine, actually, his name's John, sent me a really good video yesterday. And so I was downstairs working in the kitchen and I just kind of hit the play button and was listening to this guy. Nice young man, did a wonderful video on this particular verse. And I thought about it and I thought, this is actually great information that all of us really need to know. And we need to really kind of solidify this information in our brains as we look into this topic. And I thought, oh gosh, I could sit down and try to redo everything he just said in the video, or I could just see if Laura is smart enough to just be able to play it for us on our Zoom call. And of course, trying to save time, I'd rather him do all the talking, and we can just sit down and kind of just take notes and really just sit back and listen to him. So this is the first time that Laura and I have tried to play a video like this. So please bear with us. We just practiced a little bit before our Zoom call today to make sure we could do this. One thing that I noticed, and this actually might be just my computer, not your computer, but I noticed as he was speaking, the video, the picture wasn't keeping up with the audio. So his voice was just fine. He was plugging right along, but his mouth was moving like this. So in those cases, I really have to kind of look off to the side and not really focus on his face, because I get caught up in watching his mouth not match the words and drives me crazy. So if you find yourself in the same situation, I would suggest just kind of looking off to the side and listening to what he's saying. And he's really good about actually zooming over to a picture of his Bible and showing you the verse on the page, which is great. You'll be able to look at the screen in that case. But when you're looking at his face and if his mouth is not matching his words, just try to ignore that part of the video or listen to it, but don't watch his voice. So just wanted to give you a heads up. So basically, I'm going to turn this over to Laura right now. She's going to start playing this video. Do you have the name by chance, Laura, of the name of the video? And if you want the link to the video, she would be able to send that to you after the video, after watching the video. So you might tell them what the title of the video is.
The name of the video is "This Generation Faces the Great Tribulation, and Here's Biblical Proof." And it is Above Reproach Ministry. That's the channel on YouTube. I put the link on the chat on the right-hand side. And I'll go ahead and start the video in just 1 second.
And I'm going to mute myself.
In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus describes a coming tribulation that will come up.
Laura, I can't hear the sound. Did you mute yourself? I think you have to be unmuted, Laura.
I can't hear anything either.
I apologize. Let me keep it unmuted and try that one more time.
In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus describes a coming tribulation that will come upon a specific generation. And many people wonder who that generation is. Is it our generation? Are we the last generation living in these last days that will go through a tribulation? Let's look at Matthew chapter 24 to see what the scripture actually says. So here we are in Matthew 24:34, where Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this generation," and that's the generation in question, right, "will not pass away until all these things take place." And Jesus has described up to this point the great tribulation, signs of the coming, what is coming upon Jerusalem. And this is all in an answer to the question Peter, James, John, and Andrew.
Can you turn the volume up?
And their big question, you can read Matthew 24 for yourself to see what these things are. That's not what we're just looking at today. But they ask, when will these things be? Right after Jesus talks about how, you know, this temple
little louder,
thrown down and destroyed, and they go, when? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?
my speaker's up as far as it'll go.
They'll give all these different things that will take place. Deception, nation rising against nation.
Everybody else here okay? Really?
Yeah, it's at full volume.
Okay. I'll keep clicking around and see if I can't figure out why I can't make it louder.
Right, he talks about famines, he talks about earthquakes in various places. He talks about great tribulation. He talks about a falling away and false prophets. He talks about the abomination of desolation that Daniel the prophet actually spoke of, right? He talks about here this great tribulation, and it seems to be in the lifetime of whatever generation he's talking about. In other words, if we figure out who this generation is, then we know the time frame of this great tribulation that he has in mind here. Jesus is describing and referring to a specific great tribulation, okay? And he says that these things are going to happen before a specific generation passes away, okay? All these things take place. When? Well, this generation will not pass away until all those things do take place. So we have a time marker called this generation, which will last and actually, you know, be on the earth during all these things, right? So if we figure out who this generation is, we'll figure out the time frame of this great tribulation and all these things that end up taking place. That's very important to understand. So let's figure out who this generation is, just looking at scripture objectively. Try and take away all the biases and all the stuff you have, the assumptions and presuppositions. Objectively look at the text. Now, I already described in the last video that in Mark and Luke's account, I think it's Mark's account, we have the disciples here coming to Jesus privately, okay? Peter, James, John, and Andrew. And that's important because everything that Jesus describes, right? He says, you will hear of wars and rumors. He's not talking to general humanity here. He's talking to his four friends, his disciples. He's saying, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Make sure you're not alarmed, right? And then he goes on, every time he refers to you, it's not some future you. He's talking to four people in private, okay, which we have the recording of that. We have this written for our benefit and our instruction and wisdom, right? But he says they'll deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. You'll be hated by all nations, right? And he talks about how, the love of many will grow cold, but he who endures to the end will be saved. In other words, everything up to verse 34, this generation won't pass away until all these things take place. All these things seem to be taking place in the lifetime of the four apostles he's talking to. So let's figure out who this generation is. If you start in Matthew's gospel and work our way to Luke's as well, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke all account for this speech Jesus gives. Okay, in Matthew chapter 11, verse 16, we see the first reference to a generation. Okay, in Matthew 11:16, this is what Jesus says: "To what shall I compare this generation?" From now on, I'm going to use this blue highlighter to mark out this generation. To what shall I compare this generation? Well, what generation is he talking about? Well, the one that he's just described prior. He says, all the prophets in the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. And then he describes this generation that he seems to be speaking to and referencing. He says, it is like children sitting in the marketplaces, calling to their playmates. We played the flute for you and you didn't dance, and we sang a dirge and you didn't mourn. What generation does he have in mind? Watch. John the Baptist, prepared the way of the Lord, came neither eating or drinking, and they say he is a demon. Who? The generation of Jesus's day, those Israelites, the Hebrews. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is justified by her deeds. Who's he talking about? Well, the generation he's describing in an analogy, which is, it's like kids call into their friends in the marketplace. He's talking about the people, the Israelites, in his lifetime, during his day, that generation. Let's go to Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12, because he says that they accused John the Baptist of A, B, and C, and they accused Jesus of A, B, and C. These are the people alive during the ministry of John the Baptist and Jesus. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 38, we have some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. But he answered them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. Now, of course, Jesus is just making a statement about the kind of generation that seeks for a sign, which is out of unbelief and rejects all the signs that have been given prior. But he says no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. So he's saying, you'll get a sign. Who will? This generation that is adulterous and evil, seeking for a sign. You'll get a sign, but it's the sign of the prophet Jonah. What is that sign? For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So who is going to experience the sign, the evidence of this resurrection? Well, the people in Jesus's day will actually be alive to see that. They saw him crucified, and they'll see him resurrected. Go on, the men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation. What generation does he have in mind? Let's keep reading. And they will condemn it. Whoa, for they, the men of Nineveh, they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And behold, something greater than Jonah is here. He's talking about himself. Jesus is saying, I'm the greater Jonah, and you're missing it. The men of Nineveh repented when Jonah came. They are going to rise up at the judgment because they had faith, and this generation does not. You have not repented. You do not believe. You do not recognize the sign of who's in front of you, the one who's greater than Jonah. They're missing it. He's talking about his own people, the Israelites, in his day. The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment, that being the queen of Sheba, however you pronounce it, who goes to see King Solomon. And he says that queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and will condemn it, just like he says the men of Nineveh will do. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. In other words, you guys are missing the greater Solomon. This generation will be condemned. What generation is he referring to? Well, if you parallel this passage, I'm going to tell you right now, go to Mark 8:12 and go to Luke 11:29 through 32. Both Mark and Luke account for this, and they say the same thing, okay? And I didn't give you the reference from Matthew 11:16, right? But if you go to Matthew 11:16, the passage we looked at first, where he says this generation is compared to, Luke 7:31 is the parallel account of that. Okay. The next instance we have of Jesus referring to a generation is actually in Matthew 16. Okay. So far, every time he references the generation, he's referring to the people of Israel alive during his day. Now, Matthew chapter 16, verse 3, it says, in the morning, he says, you guys know, right? Oh, back it up. The Pharisees and Sadducees came to test him. They asked him to show them a sign. Again, 4 chapters later, he answered them, when it's evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. In the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you can't interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. So what is he referring to? The people who are seeking for a sign, the Pharisees, the unbelieving hypocrites and religious leaders, how is he referring to them? He's calling them an evil and adulterous generation. They're seeking for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. So he left them and departed. And the parallel passage to this is going to be Mark 8:38, where Mark accounts for the same thing. Jesus consistently, when he refers to this generation or the generation being evil and adulterous, he's talking about the people of his own nation alive in his lifetime during his ministry. If you go to Matthew chapter 17, verse 17, and I promise we're building a case here. Matthew 17:17, Jesus answered, oh, because we have a father who brought a son who's possessed, and this father apparently lacks faith. He cries out, help my unbelief, in Luke's gospel. And the father goes, I brought him to your disciples, Jesus, and they couldn't heal him. Jesus answered, oh, faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? So the generation Jesus is referring to being faithless and twisted, I think consistent with the other times he calls them evil and adulterous, it's the very people he's currently with who are alive during his lifetime. How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me. The parallel passage to this is Mark 9:19 and Luke 9:41. We take it to Matthew 23 to see what else Jesus has to say about a specific generation. Every time you see a generation referenced, besides his genealogy, it's in reference to the very Israelites, the Jewish people who are alive during his ministry and during his lifetime. Matthew 23:29. Look at what Jesus says. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build the tombs of the prophets and you decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we wouldn't have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness. What do you witness? Well, you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. That's one generation. But he's talking to a different generation. You serpents, you brood of vipers. Whoa, rough language. How are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill. Who's he talking to? The self-righteous religious leaders of his day, hypocrites. You'll crucify some, and some you'll flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that, now watch, on you, who's he talking to? The self-righteous, hypocrites, religious leaders, Pharisees, on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah. That's a large time frame to cover. All of that righteous blood, he's saying, is going to come on you. You will be held guilty for it, right? The son of Berechiah, Zechariah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Whoa. What does it mean that, they'll be held accountable or responsible or judged for the righteous blood that was shed from Abel all the way down to Zechariah? Well, he says, truly, I say to you, all these things will come upon what? This generation. What generation? Some future one? Some general vague statement about the future church? No, this people he's currently talking to. The self-righteous hypocrites and religious leaders who he's saying, you are going to kill and crucify just like your fathers did, the people that I send, the apostles mainly, not just, but primarily. And he's saying all these things will come upon this generation. Now notice, right after this, he laments over Jerusalem. And in chapter 24, right after this, we have Jesus describing these things. When the apostles say, when will these things be? And you go, well, you can't just say these things because he said these things here. He says these things will come upon this generation. Then he talks about the destruction of the temple, which is actually going to occur during the lifetime of what generation? The people of Israel who are alive during Jesus's day. And a parallel passage to Matthew 23 right here is Luke 11, 50 and 51. So by the time we get to Matthew 24, 34, describing all these things that are going to take place, all the way up to this verse right here, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Well, if you were to look at Mark and Luke's gospel alongside Matthew's gospel, every time the generation or this generation is referred to, it's referring to the people of Israel alive during the lifetime of Jesus. Why would this be any different? There would have to be some internal evidence or some clarification from Jesus to tell us he's talking about a different generation. But if we're going to be consistent, I mean, here, right here, the parallel passage to this is Mark 13:30 and Luke 21:32. Let me take you to Luke's gospel. I want to show you something real quick. This will be more convincing. So far, my case is that all the things Jesus describes in Matthew 24, verse 1 through 34, actually took place during the generation of the people that rejected and crucified him. Now, we have in Luke 17, verse 25, Jesus says this. Here's another reference to this, or the generation. It seems to be the pinnacle. The generation of Israelites during Jesus's day represents the pinnacle of human evil and rebellion and unbelief, per the words of Jesus. And you can research that for yourself. Luke 17:25, Jesus talking about when he comes, right? But first, before that happens, he must suffer many things and be rejected by who? This generation. Being who? The people of Israel during the lifetime of Jesus. And if you go to Luke 21:20, we have the same account of Matthew 24, okay? Same exact speech, but from Luke's vantage point, he he clarifies a few details that Matthew intentionally left out. One of those being, well, if you read Matthew 24, the apostles, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, they come to Jesus and they go, what will be the sign of your coming? Okay, people assume that refers to the second coming, but it's reading a lot into the text. Verse 20 of chapter 1 in chapter 21 in Luke 21:20. This is what Jesus says. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know its desolation has come near. Jerusalem is going to be surrounded by the Roman armies leading up to AD 70, but mainly in AD 70 when the temple's destroyed and they come in. They're surrounded by the Roman armies, okay? And its desolation, that's proof that it's come near. And he warns them that they actually take refuge, run away, okay? So in Luke's gospel, when they ask here, the apostles, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, in private, by the way, when they say, hey, these things, that you've talked about, teacher, when will these things be? What will be the sign when these things are about to take place? Jesus directly answers that in verse 20. It's the desolation of Jerusalem has come near, or is about to take place, when you see what sign? The sign that he's giving them, not the sign of Jonah, but for his four apostles, he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that is the sign that its desolation has come near. That is the sign they're asking about when they say, when are these things about to take place? And you might think that's a stretch, but let me take you to Matthew 16. I know we're jumping all around. This is the last reference that I really want you to see. Matthew chapter 16. And you can read the Gospels to get this consistent picture. Okay. Matthew 16:28. This is what confuses scholars and theologians. Jesus says, after saying the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, then he'll repay each person according to what he has done. People assume, and I don't know if this is an assumption we should make, people assume that is referring to the second coming, the actual judgment upon the earth, where everyone will give account of their lives and every human being will stand at the judgment seat. I don't think we can assume that. Verse 28 says, truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And after this is the Mount of Transfiguration. So scholars and theologians speculate, is he talking about that? He comes in his glory, the apostles see that on a mount. Is he talking about his resurrection? What's he talking about? Well, my inclination is this actually relates to Matthew 24. This is what I'm inclined to think. Because, okay, he says some here. Well, who's here? Well, if you read the context, we have Jesus talking to his what? Talking to his disciples. And what does he tell them? He tells them all this stuff. And then he ends by saying, there are some standing here, some of his own disciples, who won't taste death, meaning they won't literally, physically die. Okay? We don't have to metaphoricalize this and make it an analogy. He's literally talking about, you won't die, some of you, until you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom, meaning this coming in his kingdom is going to happen in the lifetime of some who are standing there listening. Okay? I don't know if there's any other way around that. This is why in Luke 21:20, when he says, this is the sign, you'll see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, it seems to have been fulfilled. There's one more passage, and it's in Matthew 24:33. I forgot I have one more, so I apologize. And it's this. It's actually a part of the account where Jesus talks about the future. He says, referring to the fig tree, he says, so also, when you see these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Who is near? Well, they asked, what will be the sign of your coming? What will be the sign of you coming in judgment? And he says, well, he, being himself, at the very gates, the sign of that about to happen is when they see all these things which Luke 21:20 tells us. They'll see Jerusalem surrounded by the armies. That's the specific sign he gives them. And at the very gates is a particular phrase to use. So this is why Matthew 24:33 says this, okay? This is speaking to Jesus coming in judgment and wrath against Jerusalem and this wicked generation he's talked about. And primarily it's through the Roman army that he brings desolation upon the wicked people of Israel who've rejected and crucified him, okay? This is actually consistent with what we see in the Old Testament. When God says he's coming in judgment, he's near at the very gates of Jerusalem or Egypt or Edom or Babylon or, Israel. It's often in the Old Testament apocalyptic prophetic language that's used. God comes through an enemy army to bring judgment upon the people, whether it's Egypt, Israel, Edom, Babylon. Go read the Old Testament and find out. So when Jesus says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things takes place, it is most consistent with Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel to say that the generation he's referring to, no matter how ridiculous the statements he makes prior to this scene where it's like the stars haven't fallen and the sun hasn't been turned, this generation of Jesus's day, the Israelites who are alive during his ministry, they won't pass away until all the things he's described up to this point happen. That's when they see Jerusalem surrounded by the Roman armies, that's what it seems like. That's when you know he's at the very gates, bringing judgment upon the wicked generation that crucified their Savior. In other words, the tribulation that takes place in the lifetime of this generation seems to have taken place, and this is where we'll make future videos to explain this. For now, don't get mean in the comments, but know this, I think I've proven and made the case for the fact that this generation has to be. There's no way to theologically do gymnastics around this. You'd have to jump through a lot of hoops. This generation refers to the people of Israel alive during the lifetime of Jesus, which means the implications on the Great Tribulation that he refers to prior to this, these things taking place, actually takes place in the lifetime of that generation. Listen, if you want to learn how to read and study the Bible, maybe you're bored, frustrated, overwhelmed, I encourage you to click the link in the YouTube description below and check out our free 40-day Bible study program. It's online, it's self-paced, again, it's free, and it will really help you take your Bible study to a new level. Go check that out and visit abovereproachministry.com. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you haven't already subscribed, go ahead and do that and hit the bell so you can be notified of any future videos that come out. And check out abovereproachministry.com.
Okay. Well, I apologize for anybody who has a hard time hearing his video. I would recommend going out and watching it, maybe afterwards, if it has better sound for you at that point. It sounds great on my computer, not through Zoom. So again, I would recommend doing that. Laura, why don't you tell us again what the name of that video was, if you don't mind? I didn't write it down, actually.
Oh, I never unmuted. I never muted myself. Sorry.
And she posted in the chat page.
Oh, yes.
Yes. This generation faces the great tribulation, and here's biblical proof. Above Reproach Ministries is the name of the channel.
All right. So hopefully, hopefully at this point you can really start to see that Jesus is speaking directly to his disciples. And he is not referring to some future generation 2,000 years down the road. So these things were expected to happen, and they were supposed to be coming fairly soon after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. So it's really going to solidify it in your mind, or at least that's my hope, that you understand that these are talking about those days and not days to come in the future. So just a good video to watch. And if you have others that are still future minded and are at least willing to listen, then maybe they will start to see something they hadn't seen before. Okay, so were there any questions that anybody had on that particular video? If not, we'll just continue on. We'll start looking at the third and final questions that the disciples asked Jesus in Matthew 24. No questions? Okay. So let's look at this third question. The third question actually was, what would be the sign of the end of the age? So as I sat down and I started putting together my thoughts for this study, I really decided I needed to explain something to you further, because I really came to a revelation that I had something incorrect. And I mentioned in my first video that I am still studying this whole concept out of preterism versus futuristic eschatology. And the teachings that I've seen basically took this verse, Matthew 24, verse 3, and broke it up into 3 questions. And that was the disciples asking Jesus, tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and the sign of the end of the age? And since I'm fairly new at studying this out, that's basically where I'm coming from in these videos. So as I have been going through these 3 questions with you, I get down to this third question and I realize that I actually have them reversed. So there's the 3 questions, but Jesus answered the third question first, the second question second, and the first question he answered last. I was like, oh, wow, I had that backwards, because he actually answered the disciples backwards, which might actually be a Jewish thought kind of thing that I just didn't realize. So basically, what would be the sign of the end of the age? That would be back in videos 2 and 3, where it talks about all these signs that are coming. This is the wars, the rumors of wars, the plagues, the famines, all of this stuff are signs that the end of the age was coming. And the ultimate sign that the age was done and that we've moved into a new covenant age was the destruction of the temple. So basically, we were moving out of the old covenant age, the Torah age, the law age, and with the destruction of the temple, it officially could not be done anymore. The law could not be done, and it was officially moved into the new covenant age. And remember, we talked about the two ages overlapping for a 40-year time period as it was converting from one age to the next. So Jesus actually answered the third question first. Then he went into the sign of the coming, which is what we talked about this last week. What would be the signs of his coming? And then he gets to the first question, which is, tell us, when will these things be? And so today we were starting out with Matthew, just a second here. It was Matthew 36, 24:36, I'm sorry. So when he says, when will these things be? Basically, the disciples are asking him, when will the temple be destroyed? Because he had just said in Matthew 1-3, he says, do you see all these things? He turns around and he points to the temples. He says, do you see anything? Do you see all these things? Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. And Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately, said, tell us, when will this happen? So they want to know when these stones are going to be thrown down. So they want to know when the temple itself is actually going to be destroyed. And his reply for that first question is in verse 36. He says, but of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. And that's basically the question, or that's the answer to question 1. When will these things happen? Jesus said, it's not up to you to know. It's not even up to me to know. The angels don't know. Only God the Father does. So I just kind of found that interesting that he actually answered those questions in a reverse order. This just keeps us all on our toes, doesn't it? So, but honestly, the end of the age and the destruction of the temple they're so intertwined, because the destruction of the temple is the last and final sign of the end of the age. So after our video last week, we had a little bit of a discussion that was not recorded, and one of the gals that was on the recording actually mentioned that she had never really thought of Matthew 24, verses 1-3 as 3 separate questions. It was just one really big question that had 3 different facets to it. And I actually understood what she was saying. And so I think that's what kind of made me realize that he was answering these questions kind of in one big circular way, because they're all intertwined, and even his coming into his kingdom, into his throne, all happens at the same time, at the end of the age and with the destruction of the temple. So hopefully that makes sense. I didn't mean to confuse you. That wasn't my intention. I'm obviously still learning this as we go as well. Okay, so now that we've kind of have question number 3, I want to keep reading in Matthew 24, because right after that particular verse, in verse 36, he continues on from verse 37-51. But what we find, or what I noticed, is that he goes back to kind of the second question, where he's talking about the Son of Man coming into his kingdom, coming into his position of authority. So at this point, I kind of started asking myself, why is Jesus going back to point 2? He's really focusing on this coming, his coming into his position of leadership. So even though he had been talking about the signs of the end of the age and the destruction of the temple, he brings the disciples back to his coming into his position of authority. And usually there's a reason when something is brought up more than once in the Bible, it's because it's really wanting to be emphasized. So as I'm going to read it to you here, and I want you to just start really listening to not only the fact that he mentions his coming 7 different times during these 14 verses, but is he trying to emphasize something to them, the disciples, at this point? And we'll talk about that after we finish reading it. So I'm in Matthew 24, verse 37. It starts out saying, "But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving into marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be." Okay, so hopefully you're seeing a connection here. He's connecting the coming of the Son of Man to Noah. "Then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and the other left. Watch therefore that you do not know." Oh, it says, I'm sorry. "Watch therefore, for you do not know the hour that your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household, to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Assuredly, I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, quote, 'My master is delaying his coming,' and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and at an hour that he is not aware of, and will cut him in two and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Okay, so Jesus is emphasizing a few things here. Let's talk about this. First, as I mentioned earlier, he is comparing the day of his coming to Noah and the flood and the ark. What I'm seeing as I think about this is it's a picture of the righteous men, or a righteous man, Noah, who is being taken to a safe place before the flood began. I also could look at it as it's a picture of all the righteous people being taken to a safe place before the destruction, the flood of wrath, begins. So I think he's actually telling the disciples right here in these paragraphs, you need to watch, because I'm going to send you an ark. I'm going to give you a place, a safe haven for you to go while this wrath is occurring. So he had just spent the majority of chapter 24 talking about all these awful things that are going to be happening. And they're going to see them up to a certain point. But at some point, I'm going to give you a sign, or I'm going to send an angel, or I'm going to do something that pulls you out of an area that's actually a very dangerous place to be at that point. I think that's truly what he's trying to tell them at this point. So the rest of the world / land of Israel / Jerusalem is continuing life as normal. You'll notice they were doing just as in the days of Noah. They were eating and drinking and marrying and getting married. So Jerusalem is continuing life as normal at this point. But those who were connected to Jesus through the Spirit will be removed before that flood / destruction begins. Hopefully you're seeing the picture here. So he then goes straight into the verses where it talks about the two men in the field. One will be taken and the other left. Two women grinding at the mill, one taken, the other is left. There's a lot of theories on what these verses mean that I've watched millions of videos on all this kind of stuff. But I'd like to dig into the Greek, these two Greek words a little bit deeper. It's the words being left behind, and also those who are taken. This is actually very interesting. So the word left is, and forgive me for my Greek, but it's a pheme, something like that. It's G863, and it means to send away, to let go, to expire, to give up, to keep no longer, to go away from one, or to leave one by not taking him as a companion, or to abandon. So that person was left. I like the part where it says to leave one by not taking him as a companion. And I point that out because we're going to look at the next word, which is the word taken, which is paralambano, and that's the Greek, the G3880 in your Strong's Concordance. That word taken means to take with oneself, to join with oneself, or to associate, to be a companion, to accept or to acknowledge one to be such as he professes to be, to receive something transmitted, and to receive it with your mind. So a person who was taken was one who was an associate or a companion, and who claimed, they professed that they were a Christian, for example, and they associated themselves with Christ, and they were able to receive something that was transmitted to them. They received it through their mind. So basically, I believe this is the Spirit who is allowing them to see these signs and the truth of what these signs meant. They understood what these signs were prophesying, foretelling, and they were able to know when it was time to leave Jerusalem. So hopefully you can see kind of the seriousness of the situation when you look at those two words, someone who is a companion of Christ versus someone who is not a companion of Christ. The person who's been taken has joined himself to Christ, has accepted himself as a believer, and received something transmitted to his mind. I believe this is basically saying that the believers received a message from God. And I know I just said all that, but just repeat it for you. But those who were left behind received no such warning from God. Do we have proof of this? Yes, actually we do. In studying some of the church history, we find that there is Eusebius and a man called Epiphanius, which is funny because it kind of ties in with Epiphany, but Epiphanius or something like that. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing his name right. They're both describing the Christians that they were leaving Jerusalem before the war and the siege began. Eusebius, we'll start with him. He says, quote, the people of the church in Jerusalem were commanded by an oracle given by revelation before the war to those in the city who were worthy of it to depart and dwell in one of the cities of Perea, which they called Pella. To it, those who believed on Christ traveled from Jerusalem, so that when holy men had altogether deserted the royal capital of the Jews and the whole land of Judea. So I want to just make sure you noted that this happened, the revelation was given before the war started. The war started in 66 AD, and we're going to touch on that a little bit later on today. But this revelation was given to the Christians before the war started, and they went to a place called Pella. And all of the Christians deserted Jerusalem at this point. Now we're going to look at 3 quotes from this Epiphanius guy. The first one says, this heresy of the Nazarenes exists in Berea in the neighborhood of Syria, and the Decapolis in the region of Pella, and in Basantis in the so-called Kokaba. From there it took its beginning after the exodus from Jerusalem, when all the disciples went to live in Pella, because Christ had told them to leave Jerusalem and to go away, since it would undergo a siege. Because of this advice, they lived in Perea after having moved to that place, as I said, unquote. This next quote starts out and it says, "For after all those who believed in Christ had generally come to live in Perea, in a city called Pella of the Decapolis, of which it is written in the gospel that it is situated in the neighborhood of the region of Botania and Basanitis. Ebian's preaching originated here after they had moved to this place and had lived there." That was also Epiphanes. Epiphanes, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. And then the last quote from Epiphanes is, "So Aquila, while he was in Jerusalem, also saw the disciples of the apostles flourishing in the faith and working great signs, healings, and other miracles. For they were such as had come back from the city of Pella to Jerusalem and were living there and teaching. For when the city was about to be taken and destroyed by the Romans, it was revealed in advance to all the disciples by an angel of God that they should remove from the city, as it was going to be completely destroyed. They sojourned as immigrants in Pella, and the city above mentioned in Transjordania, and this city is said to be of the Decapolis," unquote. So we have three quotes here from church fathers stating that the Christians did leave Jerusalem before the war and the siege started in 66. Well, the war started in 66. The siege itself started about 4 months before the actual destruction of the temple. So after reading all this, these quotes and kind of seeing this in Matthew 24 and 25, actually, we're going to talk about Matthew 25. It got me started thinking about the timing of all this. This sign, this revelation to the disciples happened before 66 AD. And I've always been I'd been focusing on a 7-year tribulation happening between 66 AD going to 73 AD as the possible, 7-year tribulation. And the reason I was doing that is I believe there was a temple that was built in a place in Egypt. It's mentioned, I believe, in Isaiah, and it was destroyed in 73 AD. It was like the very last place that a Jew could actually perform a sacrifice. And so I was looking at 66 to 73 AD as the possible 7-year tribulation. But now I started wondering if the 7-year tribulation, if cut in half, is 3.5 years here, 3.5 years here. So if the 3.5 years between 66 to 70 AD was the second 3.5 years, and the first 3.5 years was before that, is it possible that all of these signs started occurring from 63 AD up to 66 AD? And I apologize if I'm losing you all, but my mind starts trying to put things kind of organized in a timeline. So I started thinking about this, that, maybe the 7-year tribulation really started more in 63 AD going up to 70 AD. And the whole 73 AD, the last temple in Egypt, really didn't matter. It didn't play much of a role in the tribulation. So I'm going to go back through a couple things that we've already talked about, but hopefully you won't mind hearing them again, because I'm going to talk about some of these signs that Josephus and Tacitus both talk about. So in, late 62 AD, this would have been the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, which typically happens in September and October. So end of September into October. There was a man named Jesus. Surprise! There was a man named Jesus in 62 AD who began to prophesy the destruction of Jerusalem. And he did this for 7 years and 5 months. This is what Josephus is telling us. I've read this to you before, but it is very interesting. So if you were a disciple of Jesus, the Christ, and you knew you were supposed to be keeping watch for signs, would it not be interesting that a man named Jesus starts prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem 7 years before it really happens? Of course, you don't realize that it's getting ready to happen in 70 AD. You don't know the date or the time. You just know that there's a guy named Jesus that's starting to say exactly what your Jesus said is going to happen. So I'm going to read the account from Josephus, if you don't mind, again. So it's in the Jewish War, Book 6, Chapter 5, Section 3. And it says, "But what is still more terrible, there was one Jesus, the son of Ananus, a plebeian and a husbandman, who 4 years before the war began," so remember the war began in 66 AD. So 4 years before the war began, and at a time when the city was in very great peace and prosperity, came to that feast whereon it is our custom for everyone to make tabernacles to God in the temple. So this is the Feast of Tabernacles. Began on the sudden to cry out loud, quote, "A voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, a voice against the bridegrooms and the brides, a voice against this whole people." This was his cry. And he went about by day and by night in all the lanes of the city. However, certain of the most eminent among the populace had great indignation at this dire cry of his, and took up the man and gave him a great number of severe stripes. I'm going to just say, Jesus was also whipped. Jesus was whipped. This Jesus is also whipped. Yet did not he either say anything for himself, just like our Jesus, the Messiah, did. He didn't say anything. He didn't argue with them. Or did this Jesus, the prophet, say anything particular to those who chastised him, but still went on with the same words which he cried before? Hereupon our rulers, supposing, as the case proved to be, that this was a sort of divine fury in the man, they brought him to the Roman procurator, which, just like they did the Jesus the Messiah, they brought him to the Roman procurator, where he was whipped till his bones were laid bare, just like our Jesus. Yet he did not make any supplication for himself, nor shed any tears, just like our Jesus, but turning his voice to the most lamentable tone possible. At every stroke of the whip, his answer was, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem." And when Albinus, for he was then our procurator, asked him, who was he, and whence did he come, and why did he utter such words, he made no manner of reply to what he said, just like our Jesus did, but still did not leave off his melancholy ditty, till Albinus took him to be a madman and dismissed him. Now, during all the time that passed before the war began, this man did not go near any of the citizens, nor was seen by them while he said so. But he every day uttered these lamentable words, as if it was his premeditated vow, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem." Nor did he give ill words to any of those that beat him every day, nor good words to those that gave him food. But this was his reply to all men, and indeed no other than a melancholy presage of what was to come. This cry of his was the loudest at the festivals. Jesus did that some too. And he continued this ditty for 7 years and 5 months, without growing hoarse or being tired therewith, until the very time that he saw his presage in earnest fulfilled in our siege, when it ceased. For as he was going around upon the wall, he cried out with his utmost force, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem," woe, woe to the city again, and to the people, and to the holy house. And just as he added at the last, woe, woe to myself also, there came a stone out of one of the engines and smote him and killed him immediately. And as he was uttering the very same presage, he gave up the ghost. So again, for 7 years, you've got a guy named Jesus that's over there prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem. That might be a sign to a lot of the Christians that time was getting near. But there was also several more signs that were given during this 3.5-year period between 63 to 66 AD before the war started. Also in Josephus's book. Same book, book 6, chapter 5, section 3. We're going to read about these signs again. This was all during 63 to 66, leading up to this war. Josephus says, thus were the miserable people persuaded by these deceivers, and such as belied God himself, while they did not attend nor give credit to the signs that were so evident, and did so plainly foretell their future desolation. But, like men infatuated, without either eyes to see or minds to consider, did not regard the denunciations that God made to them. Thus, there was a star resembling a sword, which stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. Thus also before the Jews' rebellion, and before those commotions which preceded the war, when the people were come in great crowds, so the feast of unleavened bread, or to the feast of unleavened bread, on the 8th day of the month of Nisan, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone around the altar and the holy house, that it appeared to be bright as daytime, which lasted for a half an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. Basically, it was foretelling the destruction. At the same festival also, a heifer, as she was being led by the high priest to be sacrificed, brought forth a lamb in the midst of the temple. Moreover, the eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was brass and vastly heavy, and had been with difficulty shut by 20 men, and rested upon a basis armed with iron, and had bolts fastened very deep into the firm floor, which was there made of one entire stone, was seen to be open of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night. Now those that kept watch in the temple came hereupon running to the captain of the temple and told him of it, who then came up thither, and not without great difficulty was able to shut the gate again. This also appeared to the vulgar to be a very happy prodigy, as if God did thereby open them the gate of happiness. But the men of learning understood it, that the security of their holy house was dissolved of its own accord, and that the gate was opened for the advantage of the enemies. So these publicly declared that the signal foreshadowed the desolation that was coming upon them. Besides these, a few days after the feast, on the 21st day of the month of Iyar, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be fable, were it not related by those who saw it, and were not the events that followed it so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For, before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding the cities. Moreover, at that feast, which we all call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as their custom was, to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that, in the first place, they felt a quaking and heard a great noise, and after that they heard a sound as of a great multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." So this is Josephus's account. I also have Tacitus's account here of the very same things, and it's a much shorter read. But I want to read it to you because it's just important that we realize we've got two witnesses here. So Tacitus wrote, there had been seen hosts joining battle in the skies, the fiery gleam of arms, the temple illuminated by a sudden radiance from the clouds. The doors of the inner shrine were suddenly thrown open, and a voice of more than mortal tone was heard to cry that the gods were departing. You have to understand, Titus is a Roman, so he believes in more than one god, but he believes that the gods were departing. At the same instant, there was a mighty stir as a departure. Some few put a fearful meaning on these events, but in most there was a firm persuasion that in the ancient records of their priests was contained a prediction of how at this very time the East was to grow powerful, and rulers coming from Judea were to acquire universal empire. These mysterious prophecies had pointed to Vespasian and Titus, but the common people, with the usual blindness of ambition, had interpreted these mighty destinies for themselves and could not be brought even by disasters to believe the truth. So basically, Titus is saying here that there was a prediction how the East was going to grow powerful, and that the rulers of Judea were going to acquire a universal empire. And that was a false prophecy. But they believed it, and the common people also were blinded by their ambition, and they imagined these destinies were for themselves, and it couldn't be for another empire that would be coming to destroy the temple. So anyway, both Tacitus and Josephus talk about the battle in the skies and the temple being illuminated and the doors of the temple being thrown open, and that God was departing the place. Supposedly, these chariots in the clouds, this battle in the clouds, occurred in 66 AD, right before the Roman armies moved in. I believe all these signs that Joseph and Tacitus are speaking of were for the believers to leave Jerusalem, with the final sign being the abomination of desolation, which we talked about in our previous video, which meant the Roman army surrounding Jerusalem. And even Jesus himself said, when you see this, it is time for you to really get out of town. This final sign is what he's talking about in Matthew 24, verses 15 through 21. It says, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken through the prophet Daniel, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and for nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. So that was the last and final sign to the believers to leave. So if they hadn't left by then, once they saw that, they couldn't even prepare at that point. I'm guessing at that point the majority of the believers had left. There might have been a few people left that were trying to convince the Jews of Jesus being the Messiah at the last, and they were probably prepared to just up and go at that moment when they saw that, because it was basically, if they didn't get out of town, the Romans weren't going to let them get out of Jerusalem. So as I was looking into this, I started thinking about, I wanted to research a little bit what happened in 66 AD, like the beginning of the war supposedly started in this time. So what did that look like? So this is a snippet that I took from the Jewish Virtual Library on the Great Revolt. So this is from the Jewish records. This is not something that a Christian made up, but it is extremely interesting. And if you're like me, you're not familiar with the history. So these videos are a lot like a history lesson. I'll try to make them interesting, but it starts out saying that in the year 66 AD, Florus, the last Roman procurator, stole vast quantities of silver from the temple. Yikes. The outraged Jewish masses rioted and wiped out the small Roman garrison stationed in Jerusalem. So that basically is what started it. The procurator is stealing silver out of the temple, which is understandable why the Jews got mad. So they basically killed the Roman garrison at that point. Cestus Gallus, the Roman ruler in a neighboring Syria, sent in a larger force of soldiers, but the Jewish insurgents routed them as well. So basically, the neighboring Roman guy sent more soldiers in, and they also got killed. This was a heartening victory that had terrible consequence. Many Jews suddenly became convinced that they could defeat Rome, and the zealots ranks grew geometrically. Never again, however, did the Jews achieve so decisive a victory. So the mindset literally was put in place that, hey, we can do this. We can conquer the giant, right? God's behind us. We can do this. You know, I'm not sure what was going through their mind, but at that point, with those two small victories, they thought they could take on Rome. When the Romans returned, after the first two garrisons were taken out, when the Romans returned, they had 60,000 heavily armed and highly professional troops. They launched their first attack against the Jewish state's most radicalized area, which was the Galilee in the north. The Romans vanquished the Galilee, and an estimated 100,000 Jews were killed or sold into slavery. So this was truly the beginning of this awful war. Throughout the Roman conquest of this territory, the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem did almost nothing to help their beleaguered brothers. They apparently had concluded, too late unfortunately, that the revolt could not be won, and wanted to hold down Jewish deaths as much as possible. The highly embittered refugees who succeeded in escaping the Galilean massacres fled to the last major Jewish stronghold, which was Jerusalem, because of the big walls and everything that were built around Jerusalem. There, the refugees that managed to survive Galilee, they came in and they killed anyone in the Jewish leadership who was not as radical as they were. Thus, all the more moderate Jewish leaders who headed the Jewish government at the revolt's beginning in AD 66 were dead by AD 68. And not one of those people were killed by the hand of a Roman. They were all killed by fellow Jews. So do you understand the seriousness of this? This is like a civil war that's going on at this point. So the zealots who were fighting killed the first two garrisons, ended up causing 100,000 Jews to be killed in Galilee. And the survivors of that ran to Jerusalem, and they were so mad, they ended up killing the leadership in Jerusalem. So basically, if you were alive in 66 AD and were a moderate, didn't want to fight Rome, you were killed at that point. You wouldn't have lived by 68 AD. You would have been gone by that point. The scene was now set for the revolt's final catastrophe. Outside Jerusalem, Roman troops prepared to besiege the city. Inside the city, the Jews were engaged in a suicidal civil war. In later generations, the rabbis I can't read that word. The rabbis declared that the revolt's failure and the temple's destruction was due not to Roman military superiority, but to the causeless hatred among the Jews. While the Romans would have won the war in any case, the Jewish civil war both hastened their victory and immensely increased the casualties. One horrendous example is, in expectation of a Roman siege, Jerusalem's Jews had stockpiled a supply of dry food that could have fed the city for many years. Many years. But one of the warring zealots factions burned the entire supply, apparently hoping that destroying this security blanket would compel everyone to participate in the revolt. The starvation resulting from this mad act caused suffering as great as any of the Romans inflicted. So basically, the Zealots made it worse. Jerusalem could have held out for several years. Instead, the siege lasted 4 months because they ran out of food, and over 1 million people died in 4 months. Probably less than 4 months, because they probably didn't die for the first month. It was more like 3-month period. So the civil war that's going on inside Jerusalem is almost worse than what was going on the outside with the Roman siege. So I found that extremely interesting. It just helps you to see just how awful this time was. Okay, so also in my research for this study, I actually looked up Josephus's history. I know there's some folks out there that question Josephus. They say, like one person told me, oh, he's a Mason, you can't trust him. Well, okay, I don't know where they got that idea, but I don't know where they got that idea. I think a Mason supposedly is, yeah, well, anyway, not going to go there. Anyway, so I'm going to read this. This is from Wikipedia, so you can take that with a grain of salt if you want, but it was pretty interesting. So it says here that Josephus was born into one of Jerusalem's elite families. He was the second born son of Matthias, a Jewish priest. His older full-blooded brother was also, like his father, called Matthias. Their mother was an aristocratic woman who was descended from the royal and formerly ruling Hasmonean dynasty. So Josephus had good parents, or well-to-do parents, we'll put it that way. Josephus' paternal grandparents was a man also named Josephus and his wife, an unnamed Hebrew noblewoman, distant relatives of each other. Josephus's family was wealthy. He descended through his father from the priestly order of Jehoiarib, which was the first of the 24 orders of priests in the Temple of Jerusalem. Josephus was a descendant of the high priest of Israel, Jonathan Aphus. He was raised in Jerusalem and educated alongside his brother. In his mid-20s, Josephus traveled to negotiate with Emperor Nero for the release of some Jewish priests. Upon his return to Jerusalem at the outbreak of the First Jewish-Roman War, this would have been 66 AD, Josephus was appointed the military governor of Galilee. His arrival in Galilee, however, was fraught with internal division, the inhabitants of Sepphoris and Tiberias opting to maintain peace with the Romans, the people of Sepphoris enlisting the help of the Roman army to protect their city, while the people of Tiberias appealing to King Agrippa's forces to protect them from the insurgents. So, I mean, there's already division going on here at this point. Josephus also contended with John of Bershala, who had also set his sight over the control of Galilee. Like Josephus, John had amassed to himself a large band of supporters from Gischala and Gabara, including the support of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Josephus fortified several towns and the villages in Lower Galilee, among which were Tiberias, Bersabe, Salaman, Jaffa, and Tarichea, in anticipation of the Roman onslaught. In Upper Galilee, he fortified the towns of Jamnith, Seph, Meroe, and Akabara, among other places. So Josephus is a military man at this point, and he's fortifying these towns knowing that the Romans are coming. So he's doing good. He's trying to save his people. Josephus, with the Galileans under his command, managed to bring both Sepphoris and Tiberias into subjection, but was eventually forced to relinquish his hold on Sepphoris by the arrival of Roman forces under Placidus, the tribune, and later by Vespasian himself. Josephus first engaged the Roman army at a village called Garrus, where he launched an attack against Sepphoris a second time, before being repulsed. At length, he resisted the Roman army in its siege at Yodof until it fell to the Roman army in the lunar month of Tammuz in the 13th year of Nero's reign. After the Jewish garrison in Jaffa fell under siege, the Romans invaded, killing thousands. The survivors committed suicide. According to Josephus, he was trapped in a cave with 40 of his companions on July of 67 AD. The Romans, commanded by Flavius Vespian and his son Titus, both subsequently Roman emperors, asked the group to surrender, but they refused. According to Josephus's account, he suggested a method of collective suicide. They drew lots and killed each other one by one, and Josephus happened to be one of the two men that were left who surrendered to the Roman forces and became prisoners. So that happened in 67 AD. In 69 AD, Josephus was released. According to his account, he acted as a negotiator with the defenders during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, during which time his parents, Josephus's parents, were held as hostages by Simon Bar Giora. Okay, so one thing you might not know, Jerusalem during this time was divided into three parts. There was a man named John, a man named Eleazar, and a man named Simon. They have bigger names, but those are the three I can remember off the top of my head. And two of the men had a lot of troops and a lot of people on their side. And then one of the men actually had the Temple Mount. So he had extra walls. So he didn't have as many people, but he had the temple. So these three groups are fighting amongst themselves in addition to just the craziness that was going on in Jerusalem. I was trying to tie that into the book of Revelation earlier, and I think I did, but I didn't write it down. I'll have to come back to that later, but it's just an interesting little bit of history. So this guy, John, is the John that Josephus had been working with and didn't really get along with that well. And then his parents, Josephus's parents, were being held hostage by this other guy named Simon. So one of the three guys that were dividing up Jerusalem. The article goes on, it says, while being confined at Yodof, Josephus claims to have experienced a divine revelation that later led to his speech predicting Vespasian would become emperor. So this is interesting that Josephus is getting a divine revelation from God. After the prediction came true, Josephus was released by Vespasian, who considered his gift of prophecy to be divine. Josephus wrote that his revelation had taught him three things. One, that God, the creator of the Jewish people, had decided to punish them. Two, that fortune had been given to the Romans. And three, that God had chosen him, Josephus, quote, to announce the things that are to come, unquote. To many Jews, such claims were simply self-serving. But I found it interesting that, is it possible that God really did give a revelation to Josephus and basically set him up as a person to record this historically, what was going on, because it tied in with biblical prophecy coming true? So I just find that very interesting that Josephus himself even admits that this came from God. Okay, so basically I'm looking at the timeline where we have a 3.5-year period before the war starts in 66 AD, and then a 3.5-year period after 66 AD, leading up to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. That's where I'm at right now. We'll see if it sticks. So I'm pretty open to changing my mind. That's just where I am in my study. So let's go back to Matthew 24. And I am going to read kind of the end of Matthew 24, where he's talking about the coming of the Son of Man that we just read earlier. But then we're going to go straight into Matthew 25, because there is no chapter break there. It's basically Jesus continuing to talk to his disciples He doesn't stop and go get a drink or take a bathroom break. He's basically just goes right on into Matthew 24, and we're going to read because it's all talking about the same topic, the coming of the Son of Man. So Matthew 24, starting in verse 36, it starts out, but about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving into marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the handmill, one will be taken and the other left. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let the house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly, I tell you, he will put him in charge of all of his possessions. But suppose that that servant is wicked and says to himself, quote, my master is staying away for a long time. And he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Matthew 25, at that time. So we've got a continuation here. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins. Okay, this is the time that we're talking about, where the coming of the Son of Man, right here at 70 AD. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but they did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, the cry rang out, here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him. Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out. No, they replied, there may not be enough oil for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves. But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the others also came. Lord, Lord, they said, open the door for us. But he replied, truly I tell you, I do not know you. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour. Can you see the connection where he's talking about the coming of the Son of Man? And I believe the foolish virgins are the ones who did not believe as Jewish that Jesus was the Messiah. But they believed in the bridegroom. They believed in a Messiah. They just didn't believe that Jesus was that Messiah. Okay, we continue also in chapter 25. Again, it starts out saying, again, what is it? The Son of Man coming will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid the master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." The man with 2 bags of gold also came. "Master," he said, "you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more." His master replied, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. "Master," he said, "I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you." His master replied, "You wicked and lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed? Well, then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. For whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So basically, the man with the 1 bag who buried the money did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Then we finish chapter 25 with this last part. Verse 31, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goat. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison or go to visit you?' The king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.' Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me.' They also will answer, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you?' He will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me.' Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life." This all happened, I believe, at the end of the age, when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, when Jesus, the Son of Man, came into his glory and sat on his glorious throne. That is what I have for today. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. And like I said, I'm going to continue researching this and looking for either support or evidence against it. I might be wrong, but sure seems to come together nicely with this understanding. All right, I don't see any questions. So if we do another video on this, it might be in a couple weeks or in a couple months. Just kind of depends on timing. I've got the Feast of Tabernacles coming up with my Bible study group, and I've got some Bible study that I need to prepare for that time, that blessed time with my family, my godly family. And so I'm going to have to put this on hold for a little bit, but hopefully when I come back, I will have some more information for y'all.